The stage lights may have dimmed, but the echoes of betrayal still cut like glass. Michael Anthony, the quiet backbone of Van Halen, spent decades keeping the thunder alive behind Eddie's iconic riffs. Yet, for years, whispers circled the industry. Eddie claimed he had to teach Michael every single note, as if his 3 decades of devotion meant nothing. Fans wondered, critics speculated, but Michael never fired back. He carried the silence like a weight, choosing dignity over conflict. Until now. At 70 years old, with his voice breaking and his eyes wet with memories, Michael Anthony has finally opened the vault. He is telling the story he never dared to share. The story of brotherhood, betrayal, and the truth about Eddie Van Halen that will forever change how the world remembers one of rock's greatest bands. Early years and foundation of brotherhood. Before the arenas, before the flashing lights and deafening crowds, Michael Anthony was just a boy with a trumpet in his hands and a dream that refused to be silenced. Music was not simply a hobby for him, it was an inheritance, a calling that tugged at his very spirit. Yet even as he mastered the brass instrument, something inside whispered that his path would take him elsewhere. At the age of 13, he listened to that voice. He set down the trumpet and picked up a bass guitar, a decision that would forever alter his destiny. It was not an obvious choice. Most of his friends wanted to be the star guitarists, the loud drummers, or the frontmen who commanded all the attention. Michael wanted to be different. He chose the instrument that often worked in the shadows, grounding the chaos with rhythm, creating the invisible force that made audiences move without even knowing why. Everyone was playing guitars or drums, Michael would later explain. So I thought, why not try the bass? Why not be the one to hold it all together? That decision was not just an act of rebellion. It was the quiet birth of Van Halen's future heartbeat. Meanwhile, in the suburbs of Pasadena, 2 brothers were already building their legend. Eddie and Alex Van Halen were sons of Dutch immigrants who had carried their family piano across an ocean. By their teenage years, Eddie had already become a phenomenon on guitar, his fingers moving like lightning while Alex pounded the drums with thunderous precision. They were playing under the name Mammoth, tearing through high school dances, backyard gigs, and tiny clubs with a raw energy that hinted at something bigger. Fate, as it often does in rock and roll, arrived in the form of a broken speaker. One night, both Michael's band and Mammoth were scheduled to play the same high school event. Just minutes before Eddie and Alex were set to take the stage, disaster struck. Their PA system gave out. The show could have been ruined, their chance to impress lost in an instant. But then Michael, watching from the sidelines, stepped forward with a simple gesture that would change his life. "You can use ours," he offered, wheeling over his band's equipment without hesitation. It was not a calculated move, not an attempt to win favor. It was just the decent thing to do. That act of kindness did not go unnoticed. Eddie and Alex were struck not only by the generosity, but by Michael's calm confidence. Weeks later, when their bassist Mark Stone decided to leave the group, the brothers remembered the boy who had saved their night. They reached out, inviting him to a jam session. Michael showed up, plugged in, and within minutes, the chemistry was undeniable. "It just clicked," Michael recalled years later, his face lighting up at the memory. "The first song we played felt like we had been together for years." The brothers felt it too. Eddie's revolutionary guitar style was already bending the rules of rock. Alex's drums rumbled like earthquakes. And when Michael's steady bass lines and soaring backing vocals locked in, something larger than themselves was born. The missing piece had finally fallen into place. Soon, the lineup was complete. David Lee Roth joined as the flamboyant frontman, bringing theatrical energy and a voice that could strut as loudly as his body. Together, the 4 men were not just a band, they were a brotherhood. Nights in small Pasadena garages turned into marathons of music, sweat, and laughter. They were kids chasing a sound that felt electric, unaware that they were laying the foundation for one of rock's most explosive acts. Michael would later describe those early days with a kind of reverence. "We were just 4 guys who loved playing music together. The fame, the money, the drama, none of that existed yet. It was pure. He was right. In those cramped rehearsal spaces, there were no contracts, no egos, no betrayals. There was only the joy of creating something that felt unstoppable. They played wherever they could. School gyms, backyard parties, smoky bars that barely paid enough to cover gas. But something about their sound was different. Eddie's guitar was unlike anything people had heard before. A volcanic eruption of notes that shattered the rules of what a guitar could do. Alex's drumming was relentless, a force of nature. Roth's stage presence was electric, a circus act balanced on swagger and screams. And Michael? He was the anchor, the glue. His bass lines thundered through the floorboards, his high harmonies lifted the choruses, and his easygoing presence steadied the storm. It was not long before Pasadena started whispering their name. Van Halen. In those moments, under the dim glow of high school gym lights and sticky barroom neon, none of them could have predicted the heights they would reach. Platinum records, sold-out tours, MTV dominance. Nor could they have imagined the fractures that would one day split them apart. For now, they were brothers, bound not by blood, but by something stronger. The music. Those early nights taught Michael everything he needed to know about the power of trust and chemistry. They were not simply bandmates, they were comrades standing shoulder to shoulder, ready to conquer the unknown. The foundation had been laid, the spark had been lit. The world just did not know it yet. The golden years. The year was 1977, and Los Angeles was a city alive with sound. From the clubs on the Sunset Strip to the late-night garages of Pasadena, rock and roll pulsed like electricity in the air. It was here, inside a crowded nightclub called the Whiskey A Go-Go, that Van Halen stepped into the spotlight and began to carve their legend. Michael Anthony felt the bass shake through his entire body as he stood on stage that night. The crowd roared, faces pressed together, sweat dripping from the ceiling as Eddie Van Halen unleashed guitar runs that seemed impossible for human hands. Alex pounded the drums like thunder rolling through the room, and David Lee Roth leapt across the stage like a man possessed. Michael locked in with his bass and vocals, grounding the chaos, holding it all together. They were not just another bar band. They were a storm breaking loose. The word spread fast. Even without a record deal, Van Halen had become the talk of Los Angeles. Industry insiders whispered their name. Then fate intervened. Legendary producer Ted Templeman walked into one of their shows, watched just a few songs, and saw something undeniable. He signed them to Warner Brothers Records, a decision that would ignite their meteoric rise. February 1978 changed everything. Their self-titled debut album, Van Halen, hit the shelves like a cannon blast. Tracks like Running with the Devil, Ain't Talking About Love, and Eruption tore through radios and stereos across America. Eddie's guitar was revolutionary, but beneath the fireworks, Michael's bass lines and high harmonies glued the sound together. People always noticed Eddie, former manager Noel Monk once said, but Michael's foundation was what allowed Eddie to soar. The album went on to sell more than 10 million copies in the United States alone. Practically overnight, 4 young men from Pasadena became rock royalty. With success came tours that stretched across continents. Stadiums filled, fans screamed until their voices broke, and Van Halen's shows became legendary for their energy and spectacle. Michael often described those years as the fulfillment of a dream. "We were brothers back then," he recalled. "We traveled together, partied together, created music together. It felt like nothing could stop us." And for a while, nothing could. The momentum carried them into a string of platinum albums. Van Halen 2, Women and Children First, Fair Warning, Diver Down, and then, in 1984, their masterpiece, simply titled 1984. With Jump topping the charts and MTV turning their videos into cultural events, Van Halen seemed untouchable. They were living the dream every kid, in a garage band, fantasized about. But dreams have shadows. Behind the dazzling success, egos began to clash. Creative differences grew louder with each album. The pressures of constant touring and the endless demand to outdo themselves weighed heavily. The tight brotherhood that had defined their early days was showing cracks. Michael could feel the shift. Rehearsals were less joyful, conversations more strained, and the innocence of the garage days seemed like a distant memory. Yet to the fans, none of that was visible. On stage, the band still burned with unmatched fire. Eddie's fingers blurred across the strings. Roth strutted with unmatched bravado. Alex's drums shook the ground, and Michael's voice soared above it all, binding the chaos into harmony. The golden years of Van Halen were just that. Golden, brilliant, shining, unforgettable. But like gold under pressure, the gleam was hiding fractures that would one day split the band apart. For Michael Anthony, those years were more than fame and fortune. They were proof of what four young men could achieve when they trusted each other, when music was enough, when brotherhood was unshakable. But even as the lights shone brighter, he knew the storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The contract betrayal. By 1984, Van Halen had reached the very peak of rock stardom. Their album 1984 was everywhere, blasting from car stereos, dominating MTV with the unforgettable synth-driven anthem Jump, and packing arenas with fans hungry for the band's wild energy. On the surface, it looked like a dream realized, the golden age of Van Halen at its absolute height. But behind the curtain, a darker story was unfolding, one that would scar Michael Anthony forever. It happened backstage during the massive 1984 tour. The band had just hours before showtime, the roar of the crowd already beginning to hum outside. Michael was approached unexpectedly. Eddie, Alex, and David Lee Roth stood in front of him, papers in hand. At first, he thought it might be tour paperwork, something routine. But as his eyes scanned the pages, the truth hit like a punch to the gut. These were not harmless documents, they were contracts. Contracts designed to strip him of all future songwriting credits. Contracts that would drastically slash his share of the Van Halen enterprise. And most shocking of all, the agreement was retroactive, clawing back royalties from the very album that had just catapulted them into superstardom. Michael froze. His mind raced. Years of brotherhood, of trust, of sweat and blood on stage, reduced to signatures on a piece of paper. The timing was no accident. It was a cornering tactic. They came to me just hours before we were supposed to perform, Michael would later recall. What was I supposed to do? Walk away and let down thousands of fans who had already bought tickets? The pressure was unbearable. With his bandmates staring at him, he felt trapped. Refusing to sign could derail the tour, shatter the band's reputation, and disappoint countless fans. But signing meant surrendering the rights he had earned from decades of contribution. In the end, he picked up the pen. His hand shook as he wrote his name, knowing he was giving up not just millions in future royalties, but something far greater. His place as an equal in the band he had helped build. It was like being told I was no longer an equal partner, Michael admitted years later. That after all those years, they saw me as replaceable. The betrayal cut deeper than money. Yes, the financial loss was massive. The 1984 album alone went on to sell more than 10 million copies in the US. And with his rights stripped away, Michael would see only a fraction of what should have been his share. But what truly broke him was the realization that the brotherhood was not what he thought it was. He was not standing shoulder to shoulder with equals. He was standing alone. Former manager Noel Monk would later reveal that had he been present, he would have strongly advised Michael not to sign. But in that moment, isolated and pressured, Michael chose to sacrifice his pride for the sake of the fans and the music. On stage that night, he played as if nothing had happened, smiling at the crowd, harmonizing with Roth, and locking in with Eddie's guitar. But inside, something had shifted. That night marked the beginning of the end of innocence for Michael Anthony. The cracks in Van Halen's foundation were no longer invisible. They had been carved into contracts, signed in ink and betrayal. Though the band would continue, the scars of that moment never healed. For Michael, it was the first undeniable sign that his days in Van Halen might be numbered. He swallowed his pride, carried on for the fans, and chose not to speak publicly. But deep inside, the seeds of bitterness had been planted. Seeds that would grow into the heartbreak of later years. The music world saw the lights, the energy, the unstoppable momentum. Michael saw something else. The beginning of the unraveling of a brotherhood he once thought unbreakable. The Sammy Hagar era. When David Lee Roth walked away in 1985, many believed Van Halen's story had ended. Roth's swagger and voice had defined their rise. Without him, the band seemed broken. But Eddie and Alex refused to quit. They turned to Sammy Hagar, the Red Rocker, a powerhouse vocalist with his own legacy. The gamble paid off. With Hagar at the helm, Van Halen released 4 consecutive #1 albums: 5150, OU 800 Nosti, For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, and Balance. The music grew more polished, more melodic, yet still carried the thunder that fans craved. Michael's high harmonies blended perfectly with Sammy's voice, becoming a signature of this new chapter. On stage, they were unstoppable. Michael's Jack Daniels bass swung across arenas as Sammy drove the crowd wild. For fans, this was proof that Van Halen could survive change and thrive. But behind the curtain, old wounds still festered. The betrayal of the 1984 contract remained unresolved, and Eddie's remarks about teaching Michael every note stung deeply. Michael never lashed out. He let the music speak, even as his role slowly shrank. By the late 1990s, his bass parts were reduced, his voice relegated to the background. Still, he carried himself with professionalism, giving everything he had to the fans. The Sammy Hagar era proved Van Halen could reinvent itself and dominate again. But for Michael, it was bittersweet. A reminder of what the band could achieve together, and a warning of how far the brotherhood had already fractured. The breaking point. By the mid-2000s, the cracks in Van Halen's brotherhood had grown into chasms. The camaraderie of the garage days was gone. Communication was cold, rehearsals strained, and Michael Anthony, once the band's steady anchor, was being slowly pushed into the background. Yet nothing could have prepared him for how brutally his time with Van Halen would end. It did not come with a meeting, a conversation, or even a phone call. It came with a mouse click. One afternoon in 2006, Michael was scrolling through online music news when a headline stopped him in his tracks. He was no longer a member of Van Halen. The shock was instant. After 3 decades of loyalty, after giving his youth and heart to the band, Michael found out he had been replaced, and he had to read about it like any stranger. His replacement? Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie's teenage son. For Michael, the sting was not about Wolfgang. He had nothing against Eddie's son and even admired his talent. The wound came from the way it was done. After 30 years, I didn't even get a phone call, he later revealed, his voice heavy with disbelief. Not even the courtesy of hearing it from them. The humiliation cut deep. He was not just losing his spot in a band, he was being erased from a family he had helped build. Fans were equally stunned. Message boards and concert halls buzzed with outrage. Many declared that Michael's soaring harmonies and steady stage presence were as essential to Van Halen's identity as Eddie's striped guitar or Alex's colossal drum kit. His famous Jack Daniels bass and wide grin had become symbols of the band's spirit. For thousands, it felt unthinkable to imagine Van Halen without him. But Michael, true to his character, chose dignity over anger. He did not launch bitter attacks in interviews, did not drag Eddie's name through the mud, and did not air the ugly details. Publicly, he took the high road, speaking with grace even as he was quietly devastated. Privately, however, the grief was raw. He had been disrespected, belittled, and now blindsided. Years of loyalty had been met with silence, and the betrayal hardened into something close to rage. It was the final break. For Michael, this was not just about losing a job or a paycheck. It was about losing the brotherhood he thought would last a lifetime. The band that had once been a family had cast him aside like a hired hand. Yet even in the midst of anger and heartbreak, Michael's professionalism never wavered. He poured his energy into music outside of Van Halen, finding new projects and audiences. But the pain lingered. For him, Van Halen was never supposed to end this way, without a conversation, without gratitude, without respect. The breaking point had arrived, and it was crueler than he could have imagined. New beginnings with Sammy Hagar. After his painful dismissal in 2006, Michael Anthony was left adrift. Van Halen had defined him for more than 30 years. And suddenly, it was gone. Then came a lifeline. Sammy Hagar. "Mike," Sammy told him, "let's play music that's fun again." Together they formed The Other Half, a touring act that celebrated their Van Halen years. The chemistry returned instantly. Michael felt alive again, rediscovering the joy that betrayal had nearly stolen from him. But nostalgia wasn't enough. Soon they created Chickenfoot with Joe Satriani and Chad Smith, a supergroup that silenced doubters by landing in the Billboard Top 10. For Michael, it was healing. No one questioned his talent, no one diminished his role. "We were equals," he said. "That's what mattered." Later, Sammy Hagar and The Circle gave him yet another platform, alongside Jason Bonham. Performing Van Halen classics, Zeppelin tributes, and new material, Michael's confidence returned. His grin, his bass, his voice, all shone brighter than ever. For fans, these projects proved that Michael was far from finished. For Michael, they were more than bands. They were salvation, a reminder that music was still his home. Eddie's passing and regret. On October 6, 2020, the world of rock was shaken to its core. News broke that Eddie Van Halen, the guitar genius who had redefined the very language of rock, had lost his battle with cancer at just 65 years old. Fans across the globe mourned. Social media lit up with tributes, guitarists everywhere bent strings in his honor, and an era seemed to close with him. For Michael Anthony, the news landed like a thunderclap. The man who had once been his brother in arms, his partner on countless stages, and his fiercest critic was gone. And with Eddie's death came a tidal wave of emotions Michael could not control. Grief, regret, disbelief, and an ache that words could barely touch. "When I heard Eddie was gone," Michael would later say, his voice breaking, "everything else just disappeared. The business fights, the disagreements, the hurt feelings. None of it mattered anymore. I just remembered the kid I met all those years ago. This incredibly talented guy who changed guitar forever." Publicly, Michael posted a heartfelt tribute on social media, sharing photos from their early days together and writing words of respect and sadness. Fans appreciated his grace and dignity, but what the public did not see was the deeper truth. Behind closed doors, Michael wept. He had never reconciled with Eddie. Their friendship, once unbreakable, had ended in silence. And now, with Eddie gone, it would remain that way forever. That was the hardest part. There would be no last conversation, no chance to clear the air, no moment of forgiveness. The anger that had burned for years evaporated overnight, leaving only sorrow and regret. Michael realized that time had slipped through their fingers, and the bridges that once connected them had collapsed without repair. Adding to the pain was the fact that Michael was kept at a distance from the private memorials. While he understood the family's need for privacy, the exclusion deepened his sense of loss. He was not just mourning a bandmate, he was mourning the family he thought he had belonged to, the brotherhood he once believed would last a lifetime. "He was a piece of my life for so many years," Michael admitted, tears welling in his eyes. "We grew up together, we changed music together. How do you say goodbye to that from a distance?" In the quiet that followed Eddie's death, Michael found himself flooded with memories. He remembered late-night jam sessions in dusty garages, nights on the tour bus laughing until the sun came up, and the roar of arenas as thousands of fans sang along to the songs they had created. The joy was still there in those memories, but now it was haunted by the bitterness of their falling out. Grief has a way of stripping away pride, and for Michael, Eddie's passing forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided. Some stories never get the ending we want. Some wounds remain open. Some words are left unsaid forever. I had to accept the way it ended. Michael said quietly, "Not how I wanted it to, but that's life. It's not always neat." For a man who had been blindsided, humiliated, and betrayed, it was a complicated grief. One part sorrow, one part regret, and one part acceptance. Eddie was gone, and with him went the possibility of reconciliation. But in the silence that followed, Michael began to realize that closure sometimes comes in unexpected ways. Closure through Wolfgang. Months after Eddie's passing, when the grief was still raw and the wounds unhealed, Michael Anthony received a message that surprised him. It was from Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie's son, the same young man who had once replaced him in Van Halen. The invitation was simple but carried the weight of history. Wolfgang wanted Michael to attend one of his mammoth WVH shows at the House of Blues in Las Vegas. For a moment, Michael hesitated. Nearly 2 decades had passed since any real communication with the Van Halen family. The memories of betrayal still lingered, sharp as broken glass. Yet there was something in the gesture that felt different, something that whispered of reconciliation. Michael accepted immediately, sensing this was not just a concert, but an opportunity fate had carved out of tragedy. Backstage, the meeting could have been awkward. It could have been cold, tense, or distant. Instead, it became one of the most profound moments of Michael's life. Wolfgang greeted him warmly, no grudges, no bitterness, just an open heart ready to talk. "We talked about music, about Eddie, about everything," Michael recalled later, his voice thick with emotion. There was no anger, just 2 people sharing their grief and their memories. For the first time in years, Michael felt a bridge being rebuilt, not with Eddie himself, but with the son who carried his spirit forward. As they spoke, Michael confessed what he had never said publicly. He told Wolfgang that Eddie would have been proud of him, not only for his talent as a musician, but for his courage in forging his own path. "You're a piece of my heart," Michael told him through tears, "and you always will be." That night, standing in the crowd and watching Wolfgang perform, Michael experienced something unexpected. Continuity. He saw Eddie's fire, his determination, his restless spirit, living on through his son. Each note Wolfgang played felt like a conversation between past and present, a reminder that while Eddie was gone, his essence remained alive in the music. "It gave me something I didn't know I needed," Michael admitted. Closure. Wolfgang could have carried the bitterness of the past, could have hardened himself with the grudges his father had left behind. Instead, he chose connection. He chose healing. And in doing so, he gave Michael a gift greater than any apology, the chance to finally let go of decades of anger and walk forward with peace in his heart. Reflection and legacy. Today, at 70 years old, Michael Anthony still takes the stage with the same fire that first lit his path as a teenager. With Sammy, Hagar, and the Circle alongside Jason Bonham, he continues to tour the world, playing the songs that defined a generation. His famous Jack Daniels bass still hangs from his shoulders, his harmonies still soar, and his smile still lights up arenas. But for Michael, each performance carries something more than entertainment. Every time he plays a Van Halen song, it is like having a conversation with Eddie, one that they never got to finish. Through the music, the brotherhood lives on. The riffs, the rhythms, the memories, they all intertwine on stage, keeping the legacy of Van Halen alive in ways words never could. "Every time I play those songs," Michael has said, "I feel like I'm speaking with Eddie, like we're still connected." Looking back, his story is not just about fame or fortune, nor is it simply a tale of betrayal and heartbreak. It is a story about resilience, dignity, and forgiveness. It is about the ability to endure humiliation and yet rise again. About losing a brother in anger and finding closure through his son. For fans, Michael's journey is a reminder that the legends we see on stage are still human. Bound by pride, broken by betrayal, healed by music, and haunted by regrets. His truth about Eddie Van Halen does not erase the brilliance of their shared legacy. Instead, it paints a fuller picture. The brilliance and the flaws, the brotherhood and the fractures, the triumphs, and the wounds. At the end of it all, Michael Anthony remains what he always was, the backbone. The man who held the music steady when everything else fell apart. The voice that lifted choruses into the stratosphere. The brother who, even after betrayal, still chose dignity over destruction. And in that choice lies the real legacy. Because when the amplifiers go silent and the crowds disperse, what remains is not the contracts, not the disputes, not even the fame. What remains is the music, the memories, and the forgiveness that finally set a broken heart free. So when Michael Anthony steps onto the stage, bass in hand, and lets those first notes rumble through the floor, the audience feels more than nostalgia. They feel history. They feel brotherhood. And they feel the truth of a man who, at 70 years old, finally found peace with the story that defined his life.